or welfare. And actually they say that openly, that they're looking for something different, because welfare and happiness and well-being in general, it's something different to what's been imposed on them in the previous decades or centuries. So you have a government that states that openly. Actually, I've been told sometimes that they don't want to work with economists. And this is not for laughing. This is very serious. This is very serious. If you're a World Bank economist working with them, it's a very serious thing. So they depart from that. And at the same time, of course, there are practical reasons. Bolivia poverty headcounts have been stable for nearly 2 decades, around 60% for moderate poverty rates. And they argue that not only during this government, the previous government, lots of things have changed in Bolivia, and the poverty numbers don't change. So we also have the same argument that's been heard before about other things have changed. Enrollment rates have changed. Health conditions have changed, and these things don't show up in the poverty numbers, in the monetary poverty numbers. So they have both ideological and practical reasons to go ahead with this. So let me tell you about the challenges of building this thing in Bolivia, at least my perspective of these challenges. First of all, they have an extreme bottom-up approach. They do not want, or at least they have expressed to me that they do not want experts to come and tell them what the dimensions are or how to aggregate these dimensions. They have gone through all the different population groups, and they're asking people through ethnographic studies, what is happiness? What is vivir bien? What should be the dimensions that should be taken into consideration in order to measure well-being? Imagine this in Bolivia, where you have a country that is geographically and ethnically very, very diverse, that's being on the verge of segregation, of separation of the country during the last congregation elections and definition of a new constitution. So they said, we want experts hands-off first, and we will ask the people what is well-being, what is multidimensional well-being. And then we'll call the experts in order to see how we mix this thing up. So they both have the National Development Plan as perhaps a legal binding for measuring this thing, and at the same time they have a, let's say, an anthropological or ethnographic point of view that people should say first what is welfare, what is well-being, and what is important. This, in my view, leads to a very important problem that is being discussed in most of the theoretical papers on how to measure poverty. And it's being measured and highlighted by Eric Thorbecke in a book recently published edited by Nanaka Kwani and Jack Silver on the problem of relevance of poverty numbers and comparability or consistency of poverty numbers. And I think the approach that the Bolivians are taking on is heading them straight on to a huge intractable problem of having a measure that is both relevant and consistent. Why? Because they want something that is very, very much attuned to the needs and understanding of the people, of all the Bolivian peoples, those who live in the jungle, those who live up in the Sierra, and those who live in the south of the country. And these peoples are all very, very different. They will have different thresholds, different dimensions, and they will aggregate them very differently. So they will have very, very relevant measures for each and one of these peoples. Let's suppose they go full ahead with this methodological proposal. But these things will not be comparable even within Bolivia. Let's not say over years and among countries, but within Bolivia. Because they are starting from the point of view that they want policy measures or poverty measures that are very much attuned to what the people think and feel. So I think this tension is going to be untractable, even though it's, I would say, commendable that the Bolivians want to have something like this. But from an empirical point of view, I think it's a huge problem. The other challenge I would like to highlight is that there are many multidimensional measures of welfare made on Bolivia during the last 10 years. UNICEF has done a multidimensional measure for poverty, childhood poverty. The World Bank has 2 or 3 different studies. UNDP has also had 2 or 3 different HDI studies for Bolivia. So the Bolivians are going to have a lot of multidimensional welfare measures, which, no pun intended, but we really need to know what we're doing with this. All the international organizations are coming to Bolivia in order to provide these different measures. And that's perhaps the reason they want experts off. the big problem with all these measures, and the Bolivians know it, is that they have this stock of different studies, and the results in terms of, I'm running out of time, please, 2 more minutes. The results at the level of the municipalities are highly correlated, highly correlated. So the ranking of the HDI and some of the studies done by the World Bank in previous years, or even UNICEF, are highly correlated. So those municipalities that are in the top for one index are also in the top for another index. So what are we gaining? And they are they are very much concerned about that in order to proceed to another one. Another side to the problem. Recently, UNDP Bolivia ran a survey in order to explore what the people in Bolivia under this survey consider the most important dimensions, and the dimensions that should be into consideration in order to have well-being and welfare. More than 70% of the people answered having a good job and good earnings. That's a main concern. And they had questions about the environment, the social relations, all the other things, the happiness and fiestas and all the cultural aspects that are taken into consideration. Most of the people say, I want to have a good job and good earnings. So it seems that this is still a very strong variable that is very important in order to measure well-being, even if you ask the people themselves. So these are just basically my impressions from 1 year in Bolivia. And I think Sabine will agree with many of them because she's been working with the Bolivians a lot, and they have great admiration for your work. So my basic conclusions in this regard, and I think I will continue working on this because the Bolivians will continue working on this, and they want to have this multidimensional measure of welfare or poverty. Interesting, notice that I've been using welfare once and again because they don't want it to be a measure of poverty. They say we don't want to measure gaps, we want to measure achievements in different dimensions, and that is technically very different, right? So my conclusions are that political and operational challenges in Bolivia are daunting, and I guess that in many other countries in the world that the World Bank works, that have a very different society and cultural values than Western values, let's use the Bolivian language, will be a daunting challenge. It's not only a thing of Bolivia. I think it's something that is going to be very important in other places. However, this index will be done. I think that the wave that Sabine and Jim have started making will go all over the world. This is a tsunami. So we have to be prepared. This thing is coming. We will have these measures all over the world. So I think from the point of view of a multilateral agency, of international institutions, we have to come up to some kind of agreement on how to do this in order to compare countries, which is one of the mandates that we international organizations have, but also to comply with the needs of the countries and try to face this tension, the tension of relevance of the index and consistency of index. The literature says it's intractable. There's no way to solve it, but we have to try. And thank you very much for the time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was very interesting. And I see your missions to Bolivia have been very relaxed and easy.
They have been. The Bolivians are loving people, so.
Thank you very much. Rinku, please.
Thanks, Jaime. I'm going to discuss this from the Indian perspective. And I'm based in the Delhi office. I've been there since 2003. I've been working with the government both on the measurement of poverty and the identification of the poor. And in India, interestingly, those two are disconnected exercises. But I'll come to that. But before I get into the Indian details, I mean, just having seen the reaction, I think the UN came and released the index in India recently, or there was suddenly a flurry of discussion. And I just wanted to report a little bit on what the reactions have been. I think the primary role that the index plays, which is not necessarily what the creators want it to be, is really a cross-country beauty contest. And I, for one, think that that's actually quite useful. It can be quite useful. Certainly from the Indian perspective, it has been useful. I mean, the information that is being aggregated in terms of the different indicators, that information is already available. What has been India's progress on education, the difficulties or the lack of progress on malnutrition, that kind of information is constantly in the media. The government does focus on it. But whenever there is an aggregated index, the media picks it up, government sits up and takes notice. I mean, it leads to some parliamentary questions occasionally. At least there's some lip service that's paid to it, and it puts the issues back on the agenda. So in that sense, the multidimensional deprivation index, which looks at direct measures of deprivation, played a useful role on raising awareness. I think also in India it was it attracted comment in the media because it went along with people's perceptions of reality, which is not necessarily being reflected by the very rapid rates of growth. I mean, so there's one story about India, which is that it's been growing at 6 to 9% a year for so many years, but then you look around and there are large numbers of people who are highly malnourished. We've made a lot of progress on education, but challenges there as well, and certainly in terms of standard of living indicators, there's a long way to go. So one of the interesting things that the media picked up was really, I think, the numbers that came out. It was sort of like a reality check on the gloss of the Indian middle class, because you have the headcount rate under this MPI is 55%, which tells you that the median Indian does not, based the way your indicators are defined, if it's two education, 2 health, or 1 education, 1 health, and 3 of the standard of living indicators, if you don't meet those, then you're deprived, which is really a rock bottom kind of measure of welfare. And this says that the Indian middle class doesn't meet those standards. So when you juxtapose that against the official poverty rate in India, which is 27%, it brings to light stories that people talk about, but are not as hard hitting unless they come together into an index. I mean, that said, I've been following the blogs, and I agree that there are a lot of difficult issues to be dealt with methodologically in putting these indices together, and there's a big research agenda there. But certainly also, after listening to the Mexican story, I'm convinced that these indices can be powerful. So I just want to leave it at that as a raising awareness sort of tool. As a monitoring tool, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the disaggregated indicators are more useful for monitoring. But let me turn to where this is directly useful in the Indian context at the moment. It's more not so much as a poverty index, but as a targeting device. India has had these since 1992. Periodically, it carries out a below poverty line, or a BPL census. This is a census that is carried out to identify households for social support under a number of programs in rural India, including rural subsidized food, housing. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the magnitudes that we are talking about, we're looking at about 2 percentage points of GDP worth of programs are targeted through this BPL census. It's very topical at the moment as well, because the Parliament is considering, or will be in the next session, considering a Food Security Act, which will also use the BPL census. I mean, even though it's called the below poverty line census, it is not really based on a poverty line. It's based on a poverty line only in the most general sort of sense, in that a line has to be drawn somewhere to separate people who are going to get support from those who won't. But it's not based on the official poverty line. And in fact, the most recent census, which was done in 2002, is actually a multidimensional deprivation index. Before 2002, targeting used to be based on income and consumption, actually a consumption measure. But given the difficulties of measuring consumption and its proneness to manipulation, difficulty of verification, in 2002, the government moved to a multidimensional deprivation index. This is the 2002 census, and it's the one, a lot has been written about the 2002 census. What everybody will agree on, based on the research that's been done and reports from the field, that it was a hit or miss census. I mean, it's deeply